My name is Emma Sinclair, and 3 weeks ago, I buried my father. 2 days after that, my own family put my suitcases on the porch and changed the locks on the house I grew up in. I want to tell you what happened, because by the end of it, I understood something about my father that I never saw coming, and it started with a phone call from a lawyer I'd never met, telling me my dad had left something behind. Just for me. My father, Richard Sinclair, built a small property development company from nothing. He started out pouring concrete for other people's foundations, and by the time I was in high school, Sinclair Property Group owned 4 commercial buildings and a stretch of lakefront land that everybody in our town of Millbrook, Ohio, had their eye on. He was not a soft man. He worked with his hands until the day arthritis stopped him, and even then he kept a hard hat in his truck out of habit. But with me, he was gentle in a way he wasn't with anyone else. Every Sunday morning, no matter how busy the week had been, we'd sit on the back porch and he'd pour me coffee even when I was 14 and had no business drinking it, and he'd ask me what I was thinking about. Not what I was doing. What I was thinking about. Nobody else in my family ever asked me that. My older brother, Marcus, was groomed to take over the business almost from birth. He worked alongside my father, learned the contracts, shook the hands of the men who mattered in Millbrook. My younger sister, Lily, was the peacemaker, the one who smoothed things over at Thanksgiving when Marcus and I argued about something small that was really about something big. My mother, Diane, loved my father in her own complicated way. She'd married him when he had nothing, and I think some part of her never stopped being afraid of going back to nothing. I was the one who left. I moved to Columbus for college and stayed there, working as an interior designer, coming home for holidays and for my father's Sunday coffee whenever I could manage the drive. I told myself distance was healthy. Looking back, I think distance was the only thing that kept me safe. My father died on a Tuesday in early July. A heart attack, sudden, in his office at the company. I got the call from Lily, and I don't remember the drive home. I remember standing at his desk 2 days later, staring at the coffee mug he never washed, and feeling like the floor of my life had opened up underneath me. The funeral was small and quiet, the way he would have wanted it. Half of Millbrook showed up anyway. I stood between my mother and Lily, and Marcus stood a little apart, shaking hands, already talking business with 2 men from the county planning office. I remember thinking that was strange, but grief makes everything strange, so I let it go. 2 days after the funeral, my mother asked me to come by the house to help sort through Dad's things. I thought it would be the 2 of us, maybe Lily. Instead, Marcus was there, and so was a folder of paperwork spread across the kitchen table, the same table where Dad used to eat cereal standing up because he said sitting down was a waste of 5 minutes. "We need to talk about the house," Marcus said, before I'd even taken my coat off. "Okay," I said. "What about it?" "Mom's staying here, obviously. But there's no reason for you to keep a room here anymore. You haven't lived here in 8 years. I laughed, actually laughed, because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. My mother wouldn't look at me. Lily stared at her hands. "Dad wanted this handled cleanly," Marcus said. "No drama. You've never really been part of running things here, Em. You moved on. That's fine. But it's time everybody's clear about where they stand." I asked what that meant, exactly, and he told me, flatly, that the company and the house were being restructured, that Dad had made his wishes known before he died, and that it would be easier for everyone if I didn't make this harder than it needed to be. My mother finally spoke, and her voice was so small I almost didn't hear it. She said, "Emma, honey, maybe it's better if you go stay somewhere else for a while. Just until things settle. I want you to understand what that felt like." My father had been in the ground for 2 days, and the people who were supposed to be grieving him alongside me were handing me a script that had clearly been written before I walked through the door. I asked to see the will. Marcus said the estate was still being finalized, and that I'd be informed when there was something to inform me of. I asked Lily quietly in the hallway if she knew what was going on. She squeezed my hand and said, "Just go along with it for now, please." Her eyes were wet. I didn't understand it then, but I understand now. That was the first time my little sister tried to warn me without actually telling me anything. I kept thinking about a memory from years earlier, one that didn't make sense to me until much later. I was maybe 22, home for a weekend, and I found my father at the kitchen table late at night with a calculator and a stack of bank statements, the kind of scene that would become horribly familiar to me later. When I asked what he was doing, he just smiled and said, "Making sure the numbers still love me back," and told me to go to bed. I laughed about it at the time. I didn't think about it again until I was standing in that same kitchen being told to leave, and something in the back of my mind whispered that maybe my father had been doing that kind of late-night arithmetic for longer than any of us realized. There was a cousin of ours, a man named Todd Ferris, who did occasional consulting work for the company, and in those first confused days after the funeral, I'll admit my suspicion landed on him before it landed on anyone in my own family. Todd had access to some of the vendor contracts. He'd had a falling out with my father over a canceled project 2 years earlier, and he was conveniently absent from the funeral, which struck me as strange at the time. I spent an evening convinced I'd found my answer, only to learn later, once Walter's accountant traced the login timestamps properly, that Todd hadn't touched the company's systems in over a year. His access credentials had been deactivated the same month the falling out happened. He was innocent, just a man who'd had a bad falling out with my father and nothing more. It humbled me, chasing the wrong ghost while the real one sat across the table from me at every holiday. I left that house with 2 suitcases and a box of photographs I grabbed off the hallway shelf before Marcus could stop me. I checked into a motel off Route 9 and cried until I didn't have anything left, wondering if maybe I really had been the problem all along, the daughter who left, the one who wasn't there enough, the one who didn't deserve a place in the family my father built. 4 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Miss Sinclair? My name is Walter Greaves. I was your father's attorney." I'd never heard the name. My father had a company lawyer, a man named Feldman who handled contracts and permits, but Walter Greaves introduced himself as something different, my father's personal counsel, a small private practice 2 towns over in Ashford. He asked if I could come to his office. He said it was important and that it concerned my father's final wishes. I sat in Walter Greaves's office the next morning, in a chair across from a man who looked to be in his 70s, with reading glasses pushed up into thinning gray hair and a manila folder in front of him that he didn't open right away. "Your father came to me 18 months ago," he said. "Not Feldman. Me. He wanted something handled privately, outside the company's usual channels." "What kind of something?" "A letter," Walter said. "Written for you and you only." He was very specific about the timing, Miss Sinclair. He instructed me not to deliver it until after his passing, and not until I had confirmation that you'd been removed from the family home. I felt something cold move through my chest. He knew that would happen? He didn't tell me why, Walter said. But he was clear. He said, and I'm reading this from my notes, if they push her out, that's when she needs to hear from me. Not before. I sat with that for a long moment. My father had anticipated this. He had known, or at least suspected, that his own family would turn on me the moment he was gone, and instead of stopping it while he was alive, he'd built a plan for after. I didn't know whether to feel comforted or devastated. I settled on both. Walter opened the folder. Inside was a single envelope, my name written across it in my father's handwriting, the same handwriting from 30 years of birthday cards. "Before I read this to you," Walter said, "there's something else. Your father left you a key." He slid a small brass key across the desk, old, worn smooth at the edges. "He didn't tell me what it opens. He said you'd know when the time came." I turned the key over in my fingers. I had no idea what it opened. But something about holding it made my father feel closer than he had since the funeral. Walter began to read. "Emma, if you're hearing this, it means they did exactly what I was afraid they'd do, and I'm sorry I wasn't there to stop it. I want you to know first, before anything else, you were never the problem. You were the only one of my children who never asked me for anything. That should have told me something a long time ago. My eyes were already burning. Walter paused, gave me a moment, then continued. I need to tell you some things I couldn't say while I was alive, because saying them would have blown everything apart before I had the proof I needed. About a year and a half ago, I found some numbers in the company books that didn't make sense. Money moving out of client escrow accounts and back in before quarterly audits. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, so I hired an outside accountant, quietly, on my own dime, to go back through 5 years of records. The letter went on to say that my father had discovered a pattern of funds being diverted from client deposits on 2 of the company's commercial projects, funneled through a shell vendor account, and returned just before each audit closed the books. A pattern that required someone with signing authority on both the escrow accounts and the vendor contracts. Someone inside the company. My father didn't name the person in that section of the letter. He said only that the discovery had frightened him badly enough that he'd started keeping a second, private set of records, and that he'd stopped trusting the office safe. I should have gone to the authorities right then. I didn't, because I wasn't sure yet, and because if I was wrong, it would have destroyed a family I already knew was more fragile than it looked. So I did something else instead. 11 months ago, I had my will amended. Not the version Feldman has on file, a second one, private, filed separately with Walter. I split my personal shares in the company differently than anyone expects. And I put the evidence somewhere only you would think to look. Walter set the letter down for a moment. There's more, he said, but I think you should read the rest. He turned the second page toward me. The second page was shorter, and in it, my father wrote that he'd left me 40% of his personal shares in Sinclair Property Group, not the token amount everyone assumed I'd get as the daughter who wasn't involved, but a controlling stake when combined with the 10% he'd separately willed to my mother, who he believed, even then, still loved him enough to eventually side with the truth. Marcus was left 30%. Lily 20%. My father wrote that he hadn't decided, when he wrote the letter, whether the imbalance would matter, whether the accounts would clear themselves, whether he'd been wrong about what he'd seen. But he wanted me to have enough voting power to ask questions nobody could silence. The key opens a storage unit at Millbrook Self-Storage, Unit 114. Everything I found is there. I couldn't keep it in the house or the office. I didn't know who I could trust in either place anymore. I'm sorry I made you carry this alone. I didn't want to believe I had to. I sat in that office and cried the kind of crying that comes from somewhere underneath grief, somewhere angrier and more frightened. My father hadn't just died and left a mess behind. He died in the middle of quietly trying to protect something, and he'd run out of time before he could finish. I drove straight to Millbrook Self-Storage, my hands so unsteady on the wheel that I had to pull over once, just to breathe. Unit 114 was small, the kind of unit people rent for a few boxes of Christmas decorations, tucked at the end of a row of identical metal doors. I stood in front of it for a long moment before I could make myself turn the key. Part of me was afraid of what I'd find. A bigger part of me was afraid of what it would mean about the people I'd grown up loving. Inside, there was a fireproof lockbox, a stack of manila folders, and an old laptop with a sticky note taped to the lid that said, in my father's handwriting, "Password is your birthday," backwards. The folders held bank statements, printed emails, and photocopies of vendor invoices going back 3 years, all annotated in my father's handwriting with question marks and dates circled in red pen. The laptop held spreadsheets my father had built himself, tracking the discrepancies month by month. It took me most of the night, sitting on the floor of a storage unit with a space heater plugged into the wall, to understand what I was looking at. But by 2 in the morning, I understood 2 things clearly. First, the missing money added up to just under $300,000 over 3 years. Second, every single diverted transaction had been approved using login credentials that belonged to my brother, Marcus. I didn't confront him right away. I went back to Walter first, because I didn't trust my own judgment in that moment, and Walter told me something that made my stomach drop even further. He said that 2 weeks before my father died, Marcus had come to Feldman's office, the company lawyer, not Walter, and asked him to draft an amendment giving Marcus expanded signing authority over the escrow accounts, citing my father's declining health as the reason he needed backup authorization. My father never signed it. But according to Feldman's own file notes, which Walter had requested after I came to him, a signature appeared on that amendment 4 days after my father's funeral, backdated to 2 weeks before his death. That was the moment I stopped grieving quietly and started fighting. I called Lily first. I needed to know how much she knew, and I needed to know if I could trust her. We met at a diner outside of town, away from Millbrook, away from anyone who might report back to Marcus. She looked exhausted in a way I hadn't noticed at the funeral, like she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and finally had somewhere to set it down. I found something in the storage unit Dad left me, I said. I know about the accounts. Lily's hands were shaking around her coffee cup. I didn't know for sure, she said. Not the specifics. But I knew Dad was worried about something for months before he died. And after the funeral, when Marcus started talking about restructuring everything so fast, before the will was even read, it didn't feel right, It felt rehearsed. Why didn't you say anything? Because Marcus told me if I made trouble, he'd say I'd been skimming vendor kickbacks too, back when I did the bookkeeping for a summer, 3 years ago. I never took anything, I swear to you, but he had access to records he could twist to make it look that way. I was scared. I'm still scared. She wiped her eyes. Mom knows more than she's saying too. I think she's known for a while. I think that's why she looks like she hasn't slept since the funeral. That was the first twist I hadn't seen coming, that my meek, peacemaking sister had been quietly threatened into silence, and that the sister I'd almost written off as complicit had actually been protecting herself from a brother who was willing to frame her rather than risk exposure. The second person I needed to understand was my mother. I went to the house, my house, though it didn't feel that way anymore, and found her alone in the kitchen, standing at the sink without actually washing anything. I know about the accounts, I told her. I know about the backdated signature. I know Dad found out before he died. My mother didn't argue. She sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands. Your father told me 6 months ago, she said. Not everything. Enough. He made me promise not to say anything to Marcus or Lily until he had proof. He was terrified of tearing this family apart over something he might have been wrong about. Her voice cracked. And then he died, and Marcus started moving so fast, and I didn't know what was real anymore. I told myself if I just kept the peace, kept everyone together, it would all work itself out. I was a coward, Emma. I let them push you out because it was easier than facing what your brother might have done. That was the third piece falling into place. My mother hadn't orchestrated my removal out of malice. She'd done it out of fear, protecting the fragile image of a family that was already broken, choosing comfort over her own daughter because she didn't have the strength to choose otherwise. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it explained it, and somewhere underneath my anger, I found I could still feel for her. The confrontation with Marcus happened 4 days later at Walter Greaves's office, with Walter, my mother, Lily, and a forensic accountant Walter had brought in to review my father's private files. I watched my brother's face when Walter laid the evidence on the table, the spreadsheets, the vendor invoices, the timeline of the backdated signature authorization. I watched 30 years of certainty drain out of him in real time. Dad was going to destroy everything I built here, Marcus finally said, and that was as close to a confession as he was going to give. The company, the reputation, everything, over a few accounting errors he didn't even understand. I was going to pay it back. I was covering a bad year, that's all it was supposed to be, and then it kept happening because the projects kept running behind, and I told myself I'd fix it before anyone noticed. Dad noticed, I said. And instead of telling you to your face, He spent the last months of his life building a case against his own son because he didn't know who else he could trust. Do you understand what that means, Marcus? He died protecting this family from you, and the first thing you did afterward was throw me out of it. He didn't have an answer for that. Nobody in the room did. What happened next wasn't a courtroom drama, and it wasn't a moment of Marcus falling to his knees and everyone forgiving each other by the end of the scene. It was slower and messier than that, the way real consequences usually are. Walter advised that the family had a choice: pursue criminal charges, which would likely end with Marcus facing prosecution and possibly prison, or handle it privately through a restitution agreement tied to his shares in the company, which my father's second will had already positioned me to control. My mother begged me, through tears, to consider the private route, not to protect Marcus, she said, but because she didn't think she could survive watching one child destroy another in a courtroom on top of everything else. Lily left the decision to me entirely. She said she trusted whatever I chose, because I was the only one in the family who'd never once tried to manipulate her. I thought about my father, about the letter, about a man who spent his last months quietly building a case instead of screaming and accusing, because he wanted the truth to be undeniable before he acted on it. I decided to honor that instinct. I didn't have Marcus arrested. Instead, with the leverage of my controlling shares, I forced a full restitution agreement, every diverted dollar repaid to the company over 5 years, Marcus removed from any financial signing authority permanently, and an independent auditor brought in on retainer for as long as the company existed. It cost him almost everything he thought he'd inherited. It didn't cost him his freedom, and some nights I still wonder if that was mercy or just my father's caution living on in me. The house was never really the issue in the end. Once the truth came out, my mother asked me to come home, and for a while I did, though it never felt quite the same as it had when my father was alive to fill the silences. I'd walk past his old office and still expect to hear him on the phone with a contractor, still expect to smell the coffee he made too strong and never finished. Grief doesn't leave just because justice arrives. It just changes shape. Lily and I grew closer than we'd ever been, two sisters who'd both been underestimated by the same brother in different ways. We started having our own Sunday mornings, the way I used to have with Dad, except now it's the two of us on her back porch, and she asks me what I'm thinking about instead of what I'm doing, because I taught her that's the question that matters. Marcus and I speak, occasionally, mostly about the business, mostly through email. He sent me a letter of his own, eventually, an actual handwritten one, apologizing in the careful, guarded way people apologize when they're not entirely sure they mean every word yet. I don't know if we'll ever be what we were before, and I've made peace with the fact that we might not need to be. Some relationships survive the truth. Some just quietly change into something smaller and more honest, and that has to be enough sometimes. My mother and I talk more now than we ever did while my father was alive. I think losing him, and nearly losing me, finally taught her that keeping the peace isn't the same thing as keeping a family together. She told me once, crying, that she wished she'd been as brave as the man she married. I told her it wasn't too late to start. I still have the key. I keep it on my desk at the office now, my office, the one I run Sinclair Property Group from these days, because the shares my father left me turned out to be exactly the protection he intended them to be. Some mornings, before anyone else gets in, I make a cup of coffee I don't finish, and I think about a man who never told me he loved me in so many words, but who spent the last months of his life building an entire hidden case just to make sure I'd be safe after he was gone. I don't think he ever imagined I'd end up running the company he built. I think he just wanted me to have the truth and trusted me to know what to do with it. It turns out that was enough. If you were in my position, would you have forgiven your family after discovering the truth? I'd really love to know what you would have done. Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Marie Tales for more emotional stories, shocking twists, family drama, and unforgettable stories. Thank you so much for watching and spending your time with me. I'll see you in the next story.